The farm gate creaked when Matilda pushed the old timber with the hand that wasn't holding her valise. The sun was already nearly touching the hills, and the orange light bathed the dirt yard of a homestead that looked weary, just like the man standing on the veranda. Jed held a baby in his arms, whimpering softly, with the cry of one already tired of asking. And beside him, a little girl of about 6 watched the stranger with eyes too hard for a child. The kitchen was dark, the wood stove cold, and the smell coming from that house wasn't of food, it was of neglect. It was then, seeing that strong man brought to his knees from within, that Matilda took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change everyone's destiny. "If you let me stay, I can make dinner." And what seemed like just the words of a hungry lass, folks, became one of the most beautiful stories these dirt tracks have carried on the wind. If you believe that sometimes the good Lord places the right person on our path, just when hope is fading, leave a like now. Subscribe to the Old Bush Yarns channel here. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any stories, and tell me in the comments from which corner of the country you're listening. Let's begin. In the bush towns, in times gone by, stories like these were spun between rivers and dirt tracks. The track that cut through that stretch of country didn't have a name on any maps, because maps didn't bother with places where the world seemed to have forgotten to arrive. It was a wide, red dirt track, squeezed between rolling, dry grass hills, and hardly anyone was seen on it at that hour. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the silence was only broken by the mournful coo of a bush pigeon hidden in the scrub. Matilda had been walking that track for nearly 3 days, stopping by the creeks for water and sleeping under the gum trees when night fell. The small leather valise bumped against her leg with every step, and inside it was little that the world would deem valuable, but everything Matilda truly owned: a change of clothes, a bone comb from her mother, and a hardback notebook where her mother's small, neat handwriting recorded recipes passed down through generations, from grandmother to daughter, daughter to granddaughter. Matilda was 22, but she carried in her body and soul the weight of someone who had lived too many lives in too short a time. Her father, a drover by trade and a wanderer by nature, died in a fall from a horse when she was still a child, leaving behind only debts and the warm longing for a man who spent more time on the road than at home. Her mother, a washerwoman with cracked hands and a gentle heart, held on for 2 more years, until tuberculosis did what sadness had failed to achieve. Matilda was left alone at 16 and was taken in by a great-aunt named Dot, who lived in a rented shack at the back of a boarding house and made a living with intricate sewing. Great-aunt Dot was a woman rigid on the outside, but she had a quiet affection that showed in her actions, and it was she who taught Matilda to make a little go a long way in the kitchen, to stretch a handful of flour into food for 3 days, to turn a beef bone into a broth that could revive even the sickest. Matilda cared for Great-aunt Dot for 5 years, watching her slowly fade like a candle burning down without haste. When her aunt's heart finally found rest one March dawn, Matilda realized she had no one else in the world. The landlord appeared before the funeral to ask when she'd be vacating. There was no inheritance, no distant relative, no man waiting. There was only the open road and the stubborn hope that somewhere, someone needed a lass who knew how to work. She gathered the little she had into her valise. She tucked her mother's recipe notebook among her clothes like a sacred relic, and left without looking back, because looking back was a luxury people without a home couldn't afford. The homestead appeared at the end of that afternoon like a mirage in the middle of nowhere. Matilda could hardly believe it when she saw the timber farm gate, the wide dirt yard, the white-walled house with a tin roof, the paddock with skinny cows, and a chook run with hens pecking aimlessly. It wasn't a rich place, but it was a place of people, and people meant the possibility of a plate of food and a corner to sleep in. She stopped at the side of the track. She tidied the braid that the wind had half undone. She brushed the dust from her light dress, which was no longer so light after 3 days of walking, and took a deep breath before pushing open the farm gate. The creak of the timber echoed across the yard and was enough to catch the attention of whoever was there. The first thing Matilda saw was the little girl. She was sitting on a low stool near the chook pen, peeling sweet potatoes with a seriousness that didn't suit any child, for it was the expression of one who had already learned that the world is not a safe place. She had brown hair cut to chin length, a simple dress of worn fabric, and a gaze that measured the stranger from head to toe, without speaking, without gesturing, without smiling. Matilda was about to open her mouth to speak when she heard crying. It came from inside the house, a faint baby's cry, whose voice was already spent from so much weeping. And along with it, the man appeared. Jed emerged in the doorway like someone stepping out of an endless battle. He was tall, with broad shoulders and enormous hands, like someone who had worked the land since memory began. But everything about him screamed exhaustion. His beard hadn't been shaved for days. His crumpled linen shirt had a milk stain on the shoulder, and his sunken eyes carried that kind of weariness that isn't cured by a night's sleep, because it wasn't just his body that was broken. In his left arm, he held a baby of about 7 or 8 months, wrapped in a rag that had seen better days, and the child squirmed and whimpered with the restlessness of one needing something the father didn't know how to give. Jed looked at Matilda with surprise and something akin to suspicion, because in those days, a lone woman on the track was something that raised questions. Matilda swallowed her nervousness and spoke with the firmest voice she could muster, apologizing for the trouble and saying she only wanted a glass of water to continue her journey. Jed carefully descended the 2 veranda steps, balancing the baby who wouldn't stop moving, and replied that there was water, but she'd have to come inside and help herself because he couldn't let go of the child. Matilda thanked him and walked towards the house, passing by the little girl who remained on the stool, following the stranger's every move with those watchful eyes. When Matilda entered the kitchen, what she saw squeezed her heart in a way she knew, for it was the same sad disorder she had seen in Great Aunt Dot's house in her last months, when the old woman could no longer keep things running. The wood stove was cold with days of accumulated ash. Dirty pots were piled in the stone sink, remnants of dry food stuck to the table. There was no sign of dinner being prepared, no smell of stew on the fire, no damper cooling on a cloth. She looked at the earthenware pot in the corner, poured herself water, and drank slowly, thinking. Then she looked again at the kitchen, the pots, the dead stove, the window through which she saw Jed in the yard trying to calm the baby without success, while the little girl resumed peeling sweet potatoes with mechanical movements. Matilda thought of the road that awaited her outside, of the uncertain towns, of the doors that might open or might not, and she thought of that house that needed someone, just as she needed a place. The decision formed before reason could argue. She left the kitchen, went to the veranda where Jed had sat with the baby, and spoke plainly, without asking permission from her own courage. "Mr. Jed, I saw the stove is cold and the children haven't had dinner. If you let me stay, I can make dinner. And if you like the dinner, we can talk about the rest." Jed looked at the lass with her undone braid and dusty dress who had appeared from nowhere, offering food like one offering salvation, and he felt a mix of astonishment and distrust, battling against the exhaustion he could no longer bear. He should say no. He should thank her politely and tell the lass to move on. But the baby was crying in his arm. His daughter was outside peeling sweet potatoes alone like a miniature old woman, and it had been 3 days since any of them had eaten a proper meal. The shame of admitting he couldn't cope weighed less than his children's hunger. He nodded briefly, and Matilda didn't wait for him to change his mind. She entered the kitchen like someone stepping into a work camp, rolled up her dress sleeves, and started with the stove. She cleaned out the old ash, arranged the firewood piled in the corner, and with the skill of someone who had done it all her life, lit the fire on the first try. As the flames gained strength, she rummaged in the pantry and found soaked beans that no one had cooked, a piece of bacon, some flour, a few eggs, and the sweet potatoes the girl was peeling outside. It wasn't much, but Matilda had learned from her mother that cooking isn't about abundance, it's about knowing how. In less than an hour, the kitchen of that homestead smelled of real food for the first time in many months. The beans bubbled thickly in the iron pot. The cooked sweet potatoes steamed on a platter. The fried eggs gleamed in the black pan, and the aroma spread through the entire house like a living presence, pushing sadness out of every corner. The little girl was the first to appear at the kitchen door, drawn by the smell like a wild animal sniffing out food. She stood there, looking at Matilda with that heartbreaking mix of hunger and distrust. Matilda didn't force conversation. She simply set the table with what she found, laid 3 plates, and served the meal in silence, as if she did this every day, as if she had always belonged in that kitchen. Jed entered with the baby in his arm, stopped at the doorway, and gazed at the set table with an expression Matilda couldn't read, but which seemed like pain mixed with something else. He sat down slowly, settled the child on his lap, and looked at the plate, as if he couldn't believe it was real. They ate almost in silence. The little girl, whom Matilda would discover was called Ruby, ate everything on her plate and then stared at the pot with a hunger that wasn't just for food. Matilda served more without asking, and the girl accepted without thanking, but ate every bite with an attentiveness that spoke more than any words. Jed ate slowly, chewing carefully, and Matilda realized he was fighting something within himself, an emotion that men of that time and place didn't allow themselves to show. The baby, who had calmed with the warmth of the kitchen and the smell of food, fell asleep on his father's lap with his mouth slightly open. And when dinner ended and silence settled in that warm kitchen, Jed looked at Matilda and simply said that the back room was empty and she could stay that night, and they'd talk in the morning. Matilda nodded her thanks and collected the plates. She washed everything in silence while Jed took the children to their rooms, and when she was alone in the kitchen, she heard the sounds of the homestead settling in for the night. The distant lowing of cattle, the wind in the orchard trees, the crackle of the last embers in the stove. Before going to the back room, her eyes paused on a photograph hanging on the living room wall between a wooden cross and a sprig of dried wattle. It was the portrait of a young woman with light eyes and dark hair, with a serene smile that seemed to bless the entire house. Matilda looked at that face and felt something strange stir within her chest, a feeling that was neither sadness nor joy, but something she couldn't yet name. She quickly looked away and continued to the room, where she lay down on the narrow bed with its thin mattress and closed her eyes, listening to the breathing of the house around her. That night, for the first time in weeks, no one cried on that homestead, neither the baby, nor the little girl, nor the man. And Matilda, who had nowhere to lay her head that morning, fell asleep feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, that cold stove had been waiting for her. The sun was still asleep behind the hills when Matilda opened her eyes on that first morning. Her body ached from the journey, but her mind was already awake before the rest, because a woman's mind, needing to prove her worth, doesn't rest well. She got up, put on the same dress she had washed the night before, and hung by the window, and walked barefoot down the dark hallway to the kitchen. Everything was as she had left it, clean and tidy, and the silence of the house was the kind that makes you hear even your own heart beating. Matilda lit the stove in the dark by practice, by touch, by the instinct that years of cooking had etched into her hands. And when the first flames illuminated the whitewashed walls, she felt she was doing the right thing. She put water to boil, found a handful of roasted coffee beans in a tin, ground them in the mill, and slowly brewed it, letting the strong aroma take over every corner like a silent invitation. Jed appeared at the kitchen door before the coffee was ready, with the baby draped over his arm and the expression of someone who hadn't slept enough, but had grown used to it. He stood for a moment, watching Matilda move around the kitchen as if she knew every nook, every pot, every spoon. And something in that scene made him uneasy in a way he couldn't explain. Not a bad uneasiness, it was the discomfort of seeing someone occupy a space that had been empty for too long. Like when you open a window after months of being shut and the light floods fiercely into your eyes. Matilda noted his presence and offered him coffee without ceremony, already preparing a cup of warm milk for the baby, with the care of one who knows a small child needs just the right amount of nourishment. Jed accepted the coffee and sat at the table, unsure what to say, because morning conversation wasn't a habit he had kept after Rosie left. It was then, over that first morning coffee, that the two struck a deal, without needing many words. Jed said he had no money for wages, that the homestead had only been producing the basics since he'd been alone, barely keeping up with the stock and crops, without having to rush inside constantly for the children. Matilda replied that she wasn't asking for wages, she was asking for a roof, food, and the right to stay, as long as she was useful. She said she knew how to cook, wash, sew, tend a garden, and raise children, and that she wasn't afraid of hard yakka. Jed remained silent for a while, turning the cup between his thick hands, and then nodded in that economical way Matilda would come to recognize as his way of saying everything without wasting a syllable. So the agreement was made, simple as a handshake at the farm gate, and Matilda rolled up her sleeves before the sun had fully risen. The first days were filled with hard work and cautious silence. Matilda transformed that abandoned kitchen into the heart of the home once more. She rose before everyone, lit the fire, prepared coffee with damper or thick toast, fed little Gus warm milk just right, and had lunch ready when Jed returned from the paddocks covered in sweat and dust. The house began to smell of people who cared. Pots shone again on the wall hooks. Clothes appeared washed and folded in the chests. The yard was swept. The neglected veggie patch was weeded anew, and little by little, new shoots of cabbage, spring onions, coriander, and mint sprouted there, which Matilda planted with seeds she'd asked a passing drover for. Jed watched it all with a wonder he tried to disguise. He'd returned from the paddocks to find the house transformed each day, his children clean and fed, dinner steaming on the stove, and he felt a gratitude so immense it sometimes ached in his chest, because gratitude, when mixed with guilt, becomes a knot difficult to untie. Guilt had lived in him since the night Rosie fell ill. It had been a fever that arrived without warning, one of those the bush folk called bush fever, that carried off strong people in a matter of days. Jed was in a distant paddock tending to a bull that had fallen into a ditch, and when he returned 2 days later, Rosie was already burning with fever in bed, her eyes glassy, her body trembling under 3 blankets. He rode all night to town to fetch the doctor, but by the time they reached the homestead, the fever had already done its damage. Rosie lasted 2 more days, delirious, calling for the children, and died on a rainy dawn with Jed's hand clutching hers. Ruby was awake when it happened. She was 5 years old and saw everything from her bedroom doorway. She saw her father cry for the first time. She saw her mother stop breathing, and from that day on, the little girl was no longer a child. It was Ruby, precisely, the challenge Matilda hadn't foreseen. The girl didn't scream, didn't throw tantrums, didn't cry. She did something worse. She ignored Matilda as if she didn't exist. When Matilda served her plate, Ruby pushed it aside and went to eat dry flour with her hands, because dry flour was what her father used to give her. When Matilda tried to comb the girl's tangled hair, she slipped away without a word and went to hide behind the chook pen. When Matilda tidied the room, Ruby would mess everything up again and put things in the wrong places where they had been before, as if maintaining disorder was a way of keeping her mother alive. It was a silent and fierce resistance, nothing childish about it. And Matilda, who had seen pain in many forms, recognized there the most dangerous pain of all, that of someone who refuses to let anything new in for fear of losing again. Matilda didn't force it. She didn't insist with the comb, didn't compel her to eat, didn't try to hug when she wasn't wanted. She simply stayed there, constant like the stove lit every morning, present like the smell of food at the right time, and let the girl come to her in her own time, if she ever did. Meanwhile, she dedicated to little Gus the kiss the child had needed for months. The baby was thin, irritable, crying a lot at night with colic that robbed everyone of sleep. Matilda realized Jed was feeding the child pure cow's milk, too heavy for such a tiny creature's stomach, and she changed everything. She began to dilute the milk, warm it to just the right temperature, add a pinch of sugar and a dash of aniseed tea. His cries diminished. In 2 weeks, Gus slept through the night. In a month, he was a different baby, chubby, cheerful, stretching his little arms when he saw Matilda approach. Jed saw all this and softened inside without realizing it. He began to return from the paddocks earlier, not because the work had lessened, but because the house had become a place where one wanted to be again. He began to talk more during meals, first about things on the farm, then about the children, then about matters of no practical use, but which filled the silence with something good. Matilda listened with genuine attention, asking questions about the cattle, about the crops, about the land, and Jed found himself explaining things with a patience he didn't know he possessed, almost smiling when she understood quickly. But neither of them touched on the subject that floated over the house like a rain cloud that wouldn't break. Neither of them spoke of Rosie. The second week brought the first outside visitor. Old Man Macca, a neighboring station owner of advanced years, appeared one Wednesday afternoon, mounted on a bay horse that had seen better days, just like its owner. He was a respected man in the region, a widower too, but of an old widowhood, the kind that becomes a hardened shell around the heart. He had lost his wife more than 15 years ago and never recovered, living alone on a homestead too big for one man, with station hands taking care of everything while he slowly faded in a rocking chair, surrounded by brandy and silence. Old Man Macca loved Jed like a son he never had, and came around now and then to check if the young fella was coping. That day, he found the house different, and the lass in the kitchen, and his eyebrows shot up higher than his hat when he took it off his head. Jed explained the situation in few words, and Old Man Macca listened in silence, his gaze wandering between the man, the lass, and the children, with the expression of one who has lived long enough to know that life weaves tangles no one plans. The old man didn't say if he approved or disapproved. He simply drank the coffee Matilda served. He praised the damper with a grunt that was the closest he came to a compliment, and when it was time to leave, he pulled Jed aside in the yard. What he said was short and direct, that the lass seemed like good folk, and that the house was looking better than he'd seen it in months, but that the town folk already knew, because drovers carried news faster than the wind. And Mrs. Higgins, Rosie's godmother, who owned the general store on the main street, was telling anyone who'd listen that Jed had taken up with a woman before his wife's mourning was complete. Jed felt his blood warm, but Old Man Macca raised a hand for calm and said he wasn't there to judge, that everyone knew the pain they carried and the remedy they needed, but to be careful because town gossip could destroy more than a flood. That night, after Jed had retired and the house grew dark, Matilda sat on the bed in the back room with her mother's recipe notebook open on her lap. She turned the pages slowly, reading the pencil notes in small, slanted handwriting. And each recipe brought with it the ghost of a memory: the orange cake from Sunday afternoons, the rice pudding from the midsummer festival, the warm milk her mother made when Matilda was sick. In the middle of the notebook, between the shortbread recipe and the guava jam, there was a torn-out page. The remaining piece of paper showed it had been ripped out in a hurry, and Matilda traced the ragged edge with an ancient sadness. It was the recipe for the birthday cake her mother used to make for her, a cream cake with guava jam that tasted of childhood and belonging. The page had been lost in the move after her mother's death, or perhaps even before. Matilda never knew. She only knew that since that recipe disappeared, she never celebrated her birthday again, because without that cake, the date was just another empty day. She closed the notebook, put it under her pillow, and put out the lantern. It was then that she heard a sound, tiny footsteps in the hallway, light as a cat's paw. Matilda lay motionless in bed, holding her breath, and heard the steps stop in the kitchen. She waited a moment, then slowly got up, walking silently to the door. What she saw squeezed her heart in an unexpected way. Ruby stood in front of the kitchen window, barefoot, in a white nightgown, her face pressed against the dark pane, looking out. The girl wasn't crying, wasn't making a sound. She just stood there, staring towards the dirt track that vanished into the darkness, waiting. Matilda understood without needing an explanation, because some things are understood with the heart, not the head. Ruby was waiting for her mother to return. Every night, while her father slept the heavy sleep of exhaustion, that 6-year-old girl would get up and go to the window to wait for her mother to appear on the track, because no one had managed to convince her heart that those who go beneath the earth don't return by the path above. Matilda returned to her room in silence, without the girl noticing, and lay with her eyes open in the darkness for a long time, feeling the weight of what she now knew. Looking after that house wasn't just a matter of keeping the stove lit and clothes washed. It was about healing wounds no one saw. Wounds that bled in the darkness, that hurt most in those too young to understand what it means to lose forever. Weeks passed with that rhythm of routine that settles in without asking permission, and Jed's homestead began to wear a face it hadn't shown in a long time. Matilda's veggie patch was already bearing its first fruits. The yard was always swept. The chooks started laying regularly again because they now had food at the right time, and the house smelled of food all day because Matilda was one of those women who cooked as if they were praying, with faith that food heals what medicine cannot. Jed worked better in the paddocks now that he didn't need to carry the baby strapped to his back or rush inside with every cry. The cattle grew fatter, the crops promised a good harvest, and the 2 farmhands who came to help with the hard yakka commented among themselves that the boss was looking like himself again. But if life was settling inside the farm gate, on the other side, a storm was slowly brewing, like those summer rains that darken the sky little by little before crashing down. The gossip reached the town before Matilda had been at the homestead for a month, and it came in the worst way, through the mouth of one who believed herself the arbiter of other people's morals, Mrs. Higgins, widow of the former store owner and now owner herself of the business, and all the conversations that passed through it. She had been Rosie's confidant, Ruby's godmother, and considered herself the guardian of the deceased's memory. She was a woman of noisy faith and selective charity, one of those who prayed the rosary at the church door for all to see and talked about other people's lives as if it were community service. When a drover who had passed the lass on the track commented in the store that he had seen a young woman entering the widower's homestead, Mrs. Higgins felt she had received a sacred mission. She spent the entire week spreading the news with that tone of false concern, which is slander's favorite disguise, saying that poor Rosie had barely cooled in her grave, and her husband had already put another in her place, that the lass must be one of those who drifted from homestead to homestead looking for a widower with land, that the children were being raised by a stranger with no family and no references. The poison spread through the town like an oil stain on water, and when Jed appeared at the monthly market to sell cheese and buy supplies, he felt the stares before he heard the whispers. Women gossiped behind the stalls, men averted their faces when he passed, and even the baker, who always saved him fresh damper, pretended he had run out. Jed wasn't a man who cared for other people's tongues. He had thick skin for that sort of thing. But when he returned to the homestead that afternoon and saw Matilda on the veranda with Gus in her arms, softly singing a lullaby while the sun gilded her face, he felt, for the first time, the fear that this situation could end, that outside pressure could spoil what was working inside. He said nothing to Matilda about the market. He kept his unease to himself, in the way men of that time did, pushing worry beneath work, like someone burying a seed and pretending to forget it. But Mrs. Higgins wasn't a woman to stick to just gossip. One Friday afternoon, as the sun was losing its strength and Matilda had just put beans to soak for the next day, the rattle of an old ute stopped at the farm gate, and 3 women got out with expressions of those attending a wake. Mrs. Higgins led the way, dressed in black as always, with a rosary around her neck and the Bible under her arm like a war shield. Behind her came 2 town gossips, Sharon and Brenda, who served more as an audience than anything else. Jed was in the paddocks, and Matilda was alone with the children. When she saw the 3 women cross the yard towards the house, her stomach clenched, but she straightened her back and went to meet them on the veranda, with the dignity of one who owes nothing to anyone. Mrs. Higgins didn't even wait to be invited inside. She said she had come to see the children, that as Ruby's godmother she had an obligation to look after her godchildren's welfare, and that the townfolk were worried about the situation in that house. Her words were coated in honey, but the poison lay in every pause, in every glance. Mrs. Higgins cast at Matilda's clothes hanging on the clothesline next to Jed's shirts, in the way she scrutinized the kitchen, looking for flaws, in the way she picked up Gus from the floor and inspected him as if expecting to find signs of neglect. Matilda remained silent, not because she was a coward, but because she knew that a poor woman with no family, fighting a woman of standing in a small town, was a lost battle before it even began. She let Mrs. Higgins wander through the house. She let the gossips make gestures and grimaces. And just when she thought the storm would pass without rain, the lightning struck. Mrs. Higgins stopped in front of Rosie's photograph on the living room wall and turned to Matilda, her eyes damp with an emotion that was half real, half performance. She said that this was Rosie's house, that this kitchen was Rosie's, that these children were Rosie's, and that no passing stranger had the right to occupy the place of a woman barely a few months in her grave. Then she looked at Matilda with a new, lingering attention and said something that chilled her blood. She said it was curious how Matilda resembled Rosie, the same kind of hair, the same way of walking, and that perhaps that's why Jed had accepted her so quickly, because he wasn't looking for a helper, but a copy of his dead wife. The gossips fell silent, and the air in the living room grew heavy, like before a storm. Matilda felt the words hit a place she didn't know she had, because until that moment, she hadn't noticed the resemblance Mrs. Higgins was pointing out. But now, with Rosie's portrait on the wall behind her and Mrs. Higgins' venomous gaze in front, doubt settled in like a thorn entering the flesh and breaking off inside. Ruby appeared in the living room doorway amidst all this, drawn by the strange voices, and when she saw her godmother, she started to cry for the first time since Matilda had arrived. It wasn't the cry of a child wanting arms. It was the cry of one who recognized someone from a time that hurt. And Mrs. Higgins took the opportunity to scoop the girl into her arms and cast Matilda a look of silent triumph, as if saying there was the proof that the children needed familiar people, not a stranger. Matilda felt the floor move beneath her feet, but she didn't waver outwardly. She waited for Mrs. Higgins and the gossips to leave. She waved goodbye from the farm gate with a steady hand, and only when the old ute disappeared around the bend in the track did she lean against the wall and let her body slide to the ground, trembling all over. It wasn't anger she felt. It was something worse. It was doubt biting from within, asking if Mrs. Higgins wasn't right, if Jed didn't see her as someone else's shadow, if that place truly was hers, or if she was just warming a borrowed space. When Jed returned from the paddocks at the end of the afternoon and found the signs of the visit, the poorly made dinner, and Matilda with red eyes she tried to hide, he didn't need much explanation to understand what had happened. He remained silent for a long time, eating without tasting, and when Matilda got up to collect the plates, he spoke without looking at her, his voice low and careful, like someone treading on dangerous ground. He said that Mrs. Higgins didn't run this homestead, and that Matilda wasn't going anywhere. Matilda stopped with her back to him, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, and asked without turning if he wanted her there for herself, or for resembling someone else. The silence that followed was one that weighed tons. Jed slowly put down his fork, looked at the back of the woman who had saved his home and his children, and felt a confusion within his chest that he couldn't untangle. He said he had never thought about that for him, Matilda was Matilda and Rosie was Rosie, and if there had been a resemblance, he hadn't noticed it. But the words came out uncertain, and Matilda perceived the hesitation as if it were a blow. She finished washing the dishes in silence, and retreated to her room without saying goodnight. And that was the first time the two slept with distance between them, not of meters, but of unresolved matters. The following days were strange and tense, with Matilda working harder than ever, but speaking less than ever, and Jed circling the house with guilt, not knowing what to apologize for. He found himself looking at Rosie's photograph on the wall and then at Matilda in the kitchen, comparing unwillingly, searching for the resemblance Mrs. Higgins had planted in his head, and getting angry with himself for not being able to stop. Matilda noticed the glances and closed herself off even more, and the house that had begun to breathe again started to suffocate anew. Ruby, with the sharp intuition that wounded children develop, felt the change in the air and became wary again, as if Mrs. Higgins' presence had reopened the wound that had barely begun to scar over. The girl stopped eating Matilda's food again. She went back to peeling sweet potatoes alone in the yard. She returned to long silences and hard stares. It was as if the entire house was regressing, undoing knot by knot everything Matilda had woven with such care. It was in that tense atmosphere that the longest night on that homestead arrived. Gus began to cough after dinner, a dry cough that turned into a cold, and before midnight became a fever. Matilda touched the child's forehead and recognized the dangerous heat she had felt many times caring for Great Aunt Dot. She prepared elderflower tea, made wet cloth compresses, held the child in her arms, trying to bring down the temperature with everything she knew, but the fever wouldn't break. Gus burned like an ember, his tiny body shaking with chills, his breath coming out with a wheeze that filled the house with fear. Jed, seeing his son in that state, felt terror creep up his spine like a living thing, because that scene was an exact repetition of what had happened with Rosie. The same fever, the same trembling, the same glassy stare. The memory returned in full, cruel, and with it came the panic of one who already knows how this story might end. Jed grabbed his hat and said he was going to fetch the doctor in town, that he wasn't going to wait for dawn, that he wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Matilda tried to argue that the track was dark and it had rained that afternoon, that the route would be dangerous, but she saw something in his eyes that brooked no argument. It was the desperation of a father who had already lost too much and couldn't bear to lose anything more. He saddled the horse in the dark, mounted without looking back, and vanished onto the track like a shadow swallowed by the night. Matilda was left alone with the two children, the baby burning with fever in her arms and Ruby sleeping in her room, unaware of anything. The house grew enormous around her, every shadow seeming bigger, every sound from the bush outside seeming like a threat. And Matilda prayed softly as she changed the compresses, asking God not to take anyone else from that house that had already paid more than its share of suffering. It was close to 2 a.m. when the worst happened. Not with Gus, who remained feverish but stable in Matilda's arms, but with Ruby. The girl woke to the sound of her brother's crying, left her room, and came to the kitchen, and what she saw collapsed her world. She saw Matilda holding the trembling, whimpering baby. She saw the wet compresses. She saw the tea on the table, saw the lantern casting shadows on the wall, and all of it merged in the mind of a 6-year-old girl with the night her mother died. Ruby's body froze in the kitchen doorway. Her eyes widened enormously, and then came the scream, a sharp, ragged scream, not of fright, but of pure terror. The terror of one reliving the worst night of her life, and unable to separate past from present. The girl began to tremble from head to toe, slid to the floor, and huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, crying in a way that wasn't a child's cry, but the lament of a wounded animal. Matilda felt desperation squeeze her, because she had a sick baby in one arm and a panicked girl on the floor, and she was alone in the middle of the night with no one to help her. But desperation is a luxury a mother cannot afford. And that was exactly what Matilda became in that hour, without realizing it, without planning it, without asking permission. She carefully laid Gus in the cot, covered the child, and knelt on the floor beside Ruby. The girl recoiled further, shying away from contact like a cornered animal, and Matilda didn't insist. She stayed there on the floor, sitting beside her, without touching, without speaking, just present, like a warm wall protecting from the wind, asking nothing in return, and began to sing. It was a song her mother sang on stormy nights. A simple, repetitive melody that wasn't meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be safe, to be the same every time, to say without words, that as long as that music played, nothing bad would happen. Matilda sang for a long time, repeating the same song as if it were a prayer, and little by little, so slowly it was barely noticeable, Ruby's body stopped trembling. The crying lessened, the sobs grew spaced out, and the girl released the knees she had pressed against her chest. At some point that neither of them would be able to pinpoint, Ruby leaned her head on Matilda's shoulder. First, she just rested it, light as a bird alighting, and then she let go completely, letting the weight of her small body fall against that woman who smelled of soap and anise. Matilda stopped singing and remained still, feeling the girl's heart beat fast against her arm, and heard as Ruby whispered with a voice broken from so much crying a single word that changed everything between them. "Stay." It wasn't a request, it wasn't an order, it was surrender. It was a 6-year-old girl, saying, with the only word she could, that she couldn't bear to lose anyone else, that she couldn't bear to wait at the window, that if that woman left like her mother had left, she wouldn't survive again. Matilda hugged the girl tightly against her chest and cried silently with her, because some pains only pass when you share them with someone who understands. Dawn found the two asleep on the kitchen floor, leaning against the wall, Ruby curled up on Matilda's lap like a pup who had finally found refuge. Gus slept in the cot beside them, his breathing calmer, his fever visibly lower. This is how Jed found them when he arrived with the town doctor, almost at sunrise, soaked with rain and mud, his horse exhausted. He stopped at the kitchen door and stood there, unable to move, because what he saw wasn't an employee looking after children who weren't hers. It was a mother holding his children as if they were the most precious things in the world. The doctor examined Gus, said it was a throat infection, that the fever would subside with the teas and compresses Matilda was already giving, that the lass had done well, and the child would be fine in a few days. Jed thanked the doctor, paid for the visit with cheese and butter because money was tight, and when they were alone again, he looked at Matilda with a clarity he hadn't felt since Rosie's death. In that moment, kneeling beside the chair where Matilda was now sitting with Ruby still asleep on her lap, Jed understood that the question about the resemblance to Rosie was the wrong question. It didn't matter if Matilda looked like Rosie or anyone else in the world. What mattered was that she had stayed, that in the darkest hour, when he wasn't there, she had held everything together alone. She held the house, she held the sick baby, she held the broken little girl, and that wasn't something someone who merely looked like someone else did. It was something someone who was someone did. He said nothing because he still hadn't found the right words, but he touched Matilda's hand with the tips of his calloused fingers, and she raised her tired eyes. And what passed between those two gazes was more than any phrase could convey. Something changed on that homestead after that night, and it wasn't something you could see with your eyes, but you could feel it in the air like rain before it falls. Jed woke up different the next morning, with a firmness in his gaze that Matilda hadn't seen before. A decision that seemed to have been born during the ride in the dark and matured upon seeing the two women in his life sleeping on the kitchen floor. He drank his coffee in silence. He looked at Ruby, who for the first time in weeks sat beside Matilda at the table and ate her damper without complaining. He looked at Gus, who was already showing improvement in his cot with less red cheeks. And then he got up, put on his hat, and said he was going to town to sort some things out. He didn't explain what those things were, and Matilda didn't ask, because she had learned that Jed was a man who spoke with actions, not promises. What Jed did that morning, the whole town knew before midday. He went straight to the chapel and sought out Father Michael, a thin man with white hair and gentle eyes, who had known Jed since he was a boy and had baptized both his children, celebrated his wedding with Rosie, and commended her body to the earth. Jed sat on the front pew of the empty church and told Father Michael everything with the raw honesty of one who doesn't know how to sugarcoat things. He told him about Matilda, about the work arrangement, about the children's improvement, about Mrs. Higgins' visit and the gossip, and he also told him, his voice lower and his hands clutching his hat on his lap, that he felt something for that woman he hadn't expected to feel again, and wasn't sure if he had the right to feel. Father Michael listened to everything without interrupting, as men who have learned that listening is more important than advising do. And when Jed finished, the priest remained silent for a while, looking at the crucifix on the altar before speaking. What the father said was simple, and Jed carried those words for the rest of his life. He said that mourning isn't a prison, and God didn't invent longing to prevent anyone from living. That honoring those who have passed isn't about withering alongside them, it's about standing tall and looking after what remains. He said that Rosie had been a good wife and a good mother, but she was with God, and the children were on earth, needing living care, not dead homage. He said that if Matilda was a decent woman, and if Jed felt in his heart what he was saying with his mouth, then he should do things properly, that he should marry her before God and the community, that he should give her the respect of a wife, and not the shame of a casual lodger. Jed left the church with a lighter chest than he'd entered, and went to make his second visit of the day. He stopped the ute in front of Mrs. Higgins' general store when business was brisk, with half a dozen people buying and chatting on the veranda. Mrs. Higgins saw him arrive and straightened up behind the counter, ready for the confrontation she knew was coming. But what Jed did took her by surprise. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't threaten. He walked into the store calmly, took off his hat out of politeness, and spoke loudly enough for everyone inside to hear. He said that Mrs. Higgins had been Rosie's godmother, and he respected that. But that respect ended where interference began. He said that Matilda was an honorable woman who had saved his children from hunger and from growing up without care, that she had done more for that family in weeks than the whole town had done in a year of his widowhood, because no one, not even Mrs. Higgins, with all the concern she claimed to have, had shown up to help when he was drowning. The silence in the store was cutting knife thick. Mrs. Higgins opened her mouth to respond, but Jed continued. He said he was going to marry Matilda, that Father Michael already knew, and that the banns would be read on Sunday, and that anyone who wanted to talk could talk all they liked, because gossip never stopped a decent wedding. He said all this looking Mrs. Higgins in the eye with a firmness that allowed no reply, and then he put his hat back on. He bought his goods at the counter, paid exactly, and left. The people in the store looked at each other, not knowing what to say, and Mrs. Higgins, for the first time in years, was left without a response, not because she lacked words, but because deep within that chest covered in rosaries and judgment, something recognized that Jed was right. She hadn't shown up to help. None of them had, and sometimes the truth hurts more than any insult. Jed returned to the homestead in the early afternoon and found Matilda in the veggie patch, kneeling in the dirt, weeding among the cabbage plants with Gus sitting on a blanket nearby, and Ruby, for the first time, playing close to her, not with her, but close, which was already an enormous victory. He got down from the ute, walked to the veggie patch, and stood watching that scene for a moment, engraving it in his memory, because he knew everything was about to change, and he wanted to remember how it was before it did. Matilda looked up and saw something different in his face, a lightness she hadn't known, and she waited without getting up, her hands dirty with soil, and her heart racing without knowing why. Jed knelt in front of her, right there in the veggie patch, among the cabbage and spring onion plants, with the smell of damp earth rising around them, and spoke in the only way he knew, without embellishment, without a speech, without getting down on one knee as in novels he had never read. He said he had gone to town to talk to the father, and that he wanted to marry her if she'd have him. He said he couldn't promise the world because his world was small. It was just this homestead, these cattle, these children, but that he shared all of it with an open heart. He said he knew she had arrived there asking only for dinner and a roof, and that he was incapable of offering pretty words, but he could offer a surname, a true home, and the certainty that she would never again need to sleep without knowing where she would wake up. Matilda stared at him, her eyes filled with tears, and her mouth trembling, and for a long moment she said nothing, because the words were all piled up in her throat, unable to come out in order. Then she asked, her voice breaking, if he wanted to marry her, Matilda herself, and not the memory of someone else. Jed understood the weight of that question and held her face between his large hands, which still had dust from the track. He looked into her brown eyes, which were not like Rosie's, because Rosie's were light, and her nose, which was not the same because Rosie's was delicate, and her mouth, which was not the same because Rosie's was smaller. And he said that he was looking at her, only her, that it was Matilda who had lit the fire in his home again. It was Matilda who had taught his son to sleep. It was Matilda who had held his daughter on the kitchen floor when the world was crumbling, and it was with Matilda that he wanted to grow old on that veranda. She said yes without saying the word, because the yes came out as both tears and laughter at the same time. And Ruby, who was close enough to hear everything, watched from a distance with that seriousness. That was her trademark. Matilda looked at the girl and extended her dirt-stained hand, not forcing, not pulling, just offering, as she had done from the very first day. Ruby remained still for an instant that seemed to last all the time in the world, and then she walked slowly, step by step, and held Matilda's hand with her small fingers, squeezing tight. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Jed looked at the two intertwined hands and knew that this was the missing blessing, more important than the father's, more important than that of the entire town. The wedding was set for 3 weeks later, enough time for the banns, and for Matilda to sew a decent dress with fabric Jed bought in town. Father Michael read the banns the next 2 Sundays, and no one came forward to object. Although Matilda was sure Mrs. Higgins would be in the front row to protest, Mrs. Higgins didn't appear at church on either Sunday, and Matilda learned later, from Old Man Macca, that the store owner had been quiet since Jed spoke to her, and some of the gossips had begun to change their tune, saying that, after all, the widower was right, and no one had come to help when he needed it. People are like that, folks. They turn with the wind. And sometimes it's enough for one person to speak the truth aloud for the castle of gossip to crumble entirely. The wedding day dawned with that clear September sky that only the bush knows, achingly beautiful blue, with a warm wind carrying the scent of orange blossoms from the orchard. The ceremony would be simple in the small-town chapel with few guests. Old Man Macca would be Jed's best man, and the wife of the homestead's oldest farmhand would be Matilda's bridesmaid, as she had no family to fill that role. Matilda got ready in the back room that would soon no longer be just hers. She put on her new dress of raw cotton with a small lace trim at the neck that she had embroidered herself at night after the children fell asleep. She braided her hair with orange blossoms Ruby had cut from the orchard. And it was precisely this detail that made Matilda cry before the ceremony. The flowers had appeared on her bed early that morning, without a note, without explanation. But Matilda knew it had been Ruby, because no one else woke before the sun in that house. In the church, Jed waited in the suit that only came out of the chest on special occasions, the same one he had worn to marry Rosie, and he didn't hide it or apologize for it. Because for Jed, wearing that suit wasn't repeating the past, it was showing that life continues on the same foundations, and that takes nothing away from anyone. When Matilda entered the chapel holding a bouquet of wildflowers with Ruby walking beside her, stepping forward with her head held high, because she had no father to offer her arm, but she had the dignity to walk alone. Jed felt his eyes burn, and he wasn't ashamed. Father Michael celebrated the ceremony with words that spoke of new beginnings and courage, of hands reaching out in the darkness and finding other hands. And when he pronounced them husband and wife, Ruby, sitting in the front pew with Gus on her lap, did something no one in that church expected. She smiled, a small, almost invisible smile, but it was that little girl's first smile in over a year. And whoever saw it felt that something was happening there that went beyond a wedding. It was a family being stitched together again with new thread on old fabric. The celebration was at the homestead, with the table set in the yard under the shade of the big gum tree, simple and abundant food that Matilda had prepared in the days prior with the help of neighbors who had finally accepted the situation. There was party rice, chicken fricassee, hearty bean stew, lamingtons, pavlova, and freshly brewed coffee. The few guests ate and chatted until the sun set, and when they left, the homestead was left with that good silence of a home filled with peace. Matilda was collecting the plates in the yard when she felt someone tugging at the hem of her dress. She looked down and saw Ruby with a folded paper in her hand, extending it with that solemnity children have when they do something they consider very important. Matilda knelt down and took the paper. She unfolded it slowly, and what she found made her legs weak. It was a recipe written in a child's round, unsure hand, full of errors and ink smudges, but perfectly legible. Cream cake with guava jam. Matilda looked at Ruby, not understanding, her heart beating so fast it seemed it wanted to leap from her chest, and the girl explained in that hurried way children have, who have much to say and little practice saying it. She recounted that she had seen Matilda looking at the recipe notebook many nights, tracing her finger over that torn page, and that one day she had asked Mrs. Higgins at the store if she knew the recipe for cream cake with guava jam, because Mrs. Higgins had an old recipe notebook that belonged to her mother. Mrs. Higgins, whom no one expected to help with anything, searched in her notebook. She found a similar recipe and dictated it to Ruby so she could copy it one afternoon when the girl went to town with Jed. The girl had kept the paper under her pillow for days, waiting for the right moment, and decided the wedding was that moment, because a wedding is a day for gifts, and this was the gift she wanted to give. Matilda held that paper like someone holding a sacred relic, and tears fell without permission, thick and hot, wetting her new dress and the recipe, and Ruby's hands which she squeezed between her own. It wasn't just a recipe, folks. It was the missing bridge. It was the girl saying she accepted Matilda not as a replacement for her mother, but as someone new to love. It was the page missing from the notebook and from life. And it was Mrs. Higgins back in town, with all her flaws and all her sharp tongue, showing that beneath the judgment sometimes exists a heart that knows how to do the right thing when a child asks. Jed found the two embracing in the yard, Matilda on her knees holding Ruby against her chest, both crying and laughing, and he knelt beside them and enveloped them in an embrace that also included Gus sleeping in the hammock and the memory of Rosie, who didn't need to be forgotten for life to move forward. The months following the wedding were of learning and tightening bonds. Matilda stopped being the helper lass and became the true mistress of the house, the one who decided the menu, who managed the pantry, who negotiated fabric prices at the store, who advised on where to sow and when to harvest. Jed discovered that sharing decisions wasn't weakness, it was intelligence, because Matilda had a practical sense he admired, and a courage to take risks that he alone wouldn't have possessed. The homestead prospered, growing into the largest in the region, with good pasture, fat cattle, a veggie patch that bore fruit all year round, and a big house with open windows where there were always people at the table and food on the stove. Gus grew strong and healthy. He became a bright child, who ran after the chooks and called Matilda Mum, with the naturalness of one who had never known another. Ruby slowly began to open up like a flower, needing time and patience. And little by little she stopped being the old child who peeled sweet potatoes in silence, returning to being a child playing in the veggie patch, inventing stories, laughing at silly things. And one full moon night, Matilda realized that Ruby no longer went to the kitchen window to wait for her mother to return. The girl slept soundly through the entire night. And that was the greatest victory Matilda won in that house, bigger than any harvest or repair. Old Man Macca, the neighbor who lived alone ruminating on his own widowerhood, began to frequent the homestead more regularly after the wedding. He would come for Sunday lunch that Matilda prepared with festive care and stayed the entire afternoon on the veranda, chatting with Jed and playing with the children in a clumsy way, like someone out of practice but with a willingness to learn. Matilda noted that the old man was changing, that being around a living family was thawing something within him that solitude had hardened. On one of those Sundays, Old Man Macca confessed to Jed, his voice thick with brandy and emotion, that he had been wrong to lock himself in mourning for so many years, that his wife wouldn't have wanted to see him rot alone in a house too big for one man, and that seeing Jed have the courage to start anew had been a slap and a lesson at the same time. Jed said nothing. He simply refilled the old man's glass again, because in the bush, some things are better said in shared silence than in any speech. A year and a half after the wedding, on a summer afternoon when the heat made the air shimmer over the land, Matilda called Jed to sit on the veranda and told him, her hands trembling in her lap, that she was expecting a child. Jed remained still for an instant, with the blank expression of someone receiving news too big for his face to grasp. And then he smiled in a way Matilda had never seen before. A smile that was whole, without shadow, without reservation, without any ghost behind it. He hugged her right there on the veranda, with the strength of one embracing proof that life hadn't given up on him. And Matilda nodded in the embrace of those arms, knowing that the question about the resemblance to Rosie had died once and for all, buried by everything they had built together. The child was born the following spring, a boy they named Tony in honor of Matilda's father, whom the road had taken too soon, but whom she never forgot. Mrs. Higgins sent a gift of a set of hand-knitted baby clothes, with a short note that simply said, "For the bub, with wishes of good health." And Matilda kept that note along with the recipe Ruby had copied, because they were proof that people can change when time and truth do their work. The years passed with the haste they have when life is truly lived. Gus grew up and became a hard-working lad who helped his father in the paddocks with Jed's same quiet dedication. Ruby became a beautiful and studious girl who learned to read with Father Michael, and then taught the neighborhood children under the big gum tree in the yard, because the town had no school, and she decided she would do it. Tony, the youngest, grew up hearing that he had two fathers in heaven, the drover grandfather and Auntie Rosie who watched over the stars, and never felt that their patched-up family was any less a family than any other. The homestead prospered, growing into the largest in the region, with good pasture, fat cattle, a veggie patch that bore fruit all year round, and a big house with open windows where there were always people at the table and food on the stove. Old Man Macca spent his last years frequenting that house, as if he were a borrowed grandfather, and when he died of old age on a winter's night, it was Jed who took care of the burial, and Matilda who cooked for the wake. Because a real family isn't just about blood. Much later, when Jed's hair had turned completely white, and Matilda's hands bore the marks of a lifetime of work, the two sat on the same veranda where everything had been decided. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky with that orange glow that only the bush knows, and the homestead around them was alive, with the sound of grandchildren running in the yard and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Ruby, now a grown woman with her own family, had come to visit with her children. Gus was in the cattle yard with his father, showing his eldest son how to milk a cow. Tony sent letters from the city where he had gone to study, and in each letter came a piece of longing and the promise to return. Matilda looked at all that the house she had found dead and helped resurrect, the garden she had planted, the veggie patch that had grown and felt a peace so profound it hurt with its beauty. Jed took her hand as he did every afternoon on that veranda, intertwining his calloused fingers with hers, and asked if she remembered the day she arrived. Matilda smiled and said she remembered everything: the cold stove, the crying baby, the serious little girl in the yard, and the enormous fear she felt that they would send her back in the morning. Jed slowly shook his head and said his fear that day was different. It was the fear of accepting help, of admitting he couldn't do it alone, of letting someone into a house he had locked shut along with his pain. Matilda rested her head on his shoulder and softly murmured the phrase she had said so many years ago: "If you let me stay, I can make dinner." Jed chuckled with that low, gruff laugh of an old man who had cried all he had to cry and now only knew how to laugh. He replied that she had done much more than dinner. She had made the entire home, the entire family, the entire life. And Matilda squeezed his hand and said she hadn't done it alone, that he had left the farm gate open that afternoon. And sometimes that's all God asks of you. Not grand feats, not miracles, just that you open the gate when someone needs to come in. And so ends this story, folks, which isn't one of love at first sight, not of passion born in a flash and dying in a storm. It's a love built by a stove lit at dawn, by a hand holding a child on a feverish night, by a plate set at the right time, by a silence that says more than any speech. Jed and Matilda, what does the name matter? Because this story happens every time someone has the courage to reach out a hand, and someone has the courage to accept it. If this story touched your heart as it touched mine in the telling, leave a like now. Subscribe to the Old Bush Yarns channel here. Hit the notification bell and share it with someone who needs to hear that starting over isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing there is. Tell me in the comments which moment clutched your chest the most. Was it Ruby's scream on the kitchen floor? Was it the marriage proposal in the veggie patch? Or was it that folded paper with the recipe the little girl kept under her pillow? I want to know what stayed in your heart. And always remember, sometimes you think you're just asking for a plate of food, but God knows what you truly need is a home. Until the next story, stay safe, and may the good Lord bless your home, just as He blessed Jed and Matilda's.